Good morning, folks. Instructor Gaynor here. We were talking about W.D. Ross's pluralistic model of ethics concerning prima facie duties. We had talked about what those duties are. We did talk about the fact that these duties are non-absolute, and there should be understood to be a good reason for that. Because if you're going to end up respecting one of these duties, there's a good chance that the real world will force you to disrespect one of the other ones. The challenge to the person using this theory is to look at the particularity of the situation and to judge which one of the duties ought to override in which situations. Which one should override in which situations. Now, we have talked about some potential examples already. Where we want to pick up is to talk about what were three main absolutist objections to Ross's account of ethics. These three are noted in the text, and I buzzed through them quickly last time, but I want to walk through them slowly. Remember, sometimes these duties will not be respected because of the particularity of the situation. An absolutist would say that if something is truly a moral duty, it is never permissible to break those. Now, Ross would say there is no contradiction problem because none of these principles are absolute. Ross wouldn't call that a detriment to his theory. He would call this a strength of his theory. Now, keep in mind, though, that the absolutist is still likely to object, because the absolutist would claim that there at least is one or more principles that ought never to be violated regardless of the situation. You may have to violate them, but don't call it moral, is what the absolutist would likely remark. Two, remember how we talked about disaster prevention being a problem for Kantian philosophers? Why? Because certain things are inherently immoral. This is why Kantians appeal to things like the doctrine of doing and allowing and the doctrine of double effect, in order to deal with what the author of the text called disaster prevention. Now, disaster prevention, you'll recall, wasn't a problem for utilitarians because of utilitarianism's flexibility. It's also not a problem for Ross. Why? Because none of his principles are absolute duties. In a sense, they are not actual duties, according to critics. Because if they were actual duties, they would be absolute. But Ross would say it's not a problem. Because in order to prevent certain unavoidable disasters, these duties are not absolute. Ergo, it is morally permissible sometimes to understand that we can't respect certain duties. Three, he thinks that absolutism is irrational because it leads to contradictions. And I'll just give you an example that I've talked about before. Remember, for Kant, we are never to use people as a mere means, but to always treat them as ends in themselves. Now, in order to do that in real-life situations, to respect someone's dignity might actually force you to disrespect other people's dignity. This is why, to resolutely follow to Kantian ethics, the pluralistic critic would say it leads to contradictions. It leads to contradictions. Now, keep in mind, a reason why Ross would not go utilitarian is because he speaks of morality just like Hume, except not in an absolutist way. You can say it if you want. Because he speaks of morality in terms of duties, it sounds like Kantian lingo. And you know what? It is Kantian lingo. It's just that he contends that these duties are not absolute. There are good reasons for doing or refraining from doing something. But sometimes we cannot respect all of these duties because of real-life situations. Now, let me run through some. I said, please keep in mind that Ross rejects the idea that his position is mostly consequentialist. Admittedly, I've talked about this before. He sides more with Kant's way of framing ethics. It's just that the duties are not absolute. Kant speaks in terms of duties. Utilitarians speak in terms of consequences. Ross's account does not really speak in terms of consequences, even though some of his prima facie duties do neatly line up with utilitarian thinking, such as the idea that we ought to try to be benevolent when at all possible, such as the idea that we ought to do our best to avoid unnecessary harms. This is indeed utilitarian kind of talk, although you'll note that Kant would agree with those principles, except he would get there by way of doctrine of double effect. So I hope this is a little chance for review while we talk about this too, because don't be surprised, the doctrine of double effect and the doctrines of doing and allowing will actually show up in some of your moral problems essays. They will show up in some of them, certainly not all of them, but some of them. Anyway, now, he agrees that maximizing good is a duty, but it's not our only duty. That's an example. He uses a thought experiment in which he argues that keeping a promise would be the right thing to do in cases in which we have obligated ourselves with a promise. Now, this sounds like Kant's talk about promises. Now, let's continue. Although some other course of action may have slightly better consequences. Remember, for Ross, fidelity was one of the main duties on the list. To keep your word is something that you ought to do. However, in real-life circumstances, other situations that might arise where that duty to fidelity may need to be overridden. I would hope that if I made a promise to my wife to be home at a certain time, but that if something happened on my way home where someone was seriously injured, some of us think we have a duty to stop and help if we have the know-how to do some good. As a matter of fact, it's been codified into law. So-called Good Samaritan laws suggest that we have not just a moral duty, but a legal duty to help out when we have a good chance of doing good in situations like that. That might be a situation where my duty to help someone in need overrides my keeping a promise. Now, admittedly, if my promise were much more serious, that might be taken into account. And a morally decent person would probably understand the need to sacrifice that duty in that particular situation. If not, that person may lack moral maturity. Oh, I'm serious. Now, the biggest challenge for Ross's view is explaining moral knowledge. I honestly don't like that phrase that the author uses. He speaks a lot about moral knowledge. I would prefer to say determining what the right thing to do is. In other words, how do we determine what the right thing to do is? And here's how I rephrase it. I said, that is, how can one know what the moral point of view would advise in any situation, as he claims that there are no absolute rules? To defend Ross's theory, one must provide an account of how we can come to know what specifies our prima facie duties. This is a difficult task for every ethical theory, and the responses fall into three camps that the author discusses. Now, admittedly, part of this conversation is where it gets a little thick. In other words, it might be a little more challenging to fully comprehend. A first group of critics the author calls moral skeptics. We will talk about moral skepticism in detail, more detail, when we do meta-ethics in the course's last 2 chapters. Moral skeptics claim that moral knowledge is impossible to have, and that we are not justified in believing in any fundamental moral rules. I'll give you the short version of that, or I'll give you an example, rather. Some moral skeptics come from the camp that we will call cultural relativists. Cultural relativists contend that all morality is in fact constructed by human beings, invented, if you will. And the viewpoints that we are likely to hold when it comes to morality are those that we are acculturated to accept. We end up being, roughly speaking, imprints of the beliefs, values, and moral accounts that are acculturated into us. But here's the rub. No culture is inherently right or wrong, because rightness and wrongness ultimately amount to that culture's opinion. The moral skeptic would say that moral knowledge isn't really possible at all. We will talk about other variants of moral skepticism a little later on in other conversations. Next, the author talks about coherentists. Coherentism claims that we can justify a moral claim by showing that it receives support from and lends support to a large number of our other beliefs. Or to put it another way, if we hold a certain group of moral principles, let's say that someone poses another possible principle. The coherentist would say, is that principle derivable and or directly consistent with the principles that we have already determined to be the case? If so, we would say, yes, that's a good principle. If it is not consistent with our body of moral truths, we would say, no, that is not a good moral principle. To put it yet another way, a coherentist looks at our body of moral truths as a sort of coherent system of truths that ought to be logically coherent with one another. Anything that does not fit isn't something that we would call moral truth or moral knowledge. Now, a third account, and this is the account that Ross holds, it is what is called the self-evidence claim. The self-evidence claim runs something like this. Reasonably thoughtful people will see or think about a moral principle, and they will say, it is evident to me that that sounds like a reasonable moral principle. In other words, upon rational reflection, you will say, that seems to me like a good moral principle. Well, guess what? Some critics will think that this doesn't sound like meaningful proof at all. As a matter of fact, they will think that it sounds, circular, like circular evidence. They might even think it just sounds like common opinion. Well, guess what? If the reasonably prudent, thoughtful person thinks that honesty seems to be a good policy, the self-evidence approach would say, in all likelihood, it probably is a good policy. When you reflect upon the principle of harm, most of us would say that harming a human being is generally not a good thing to do unless we have what? An overriding good reason for doing so. An overriding good reason for doing so. Now, the critic might say, this still seems to amount to common opinion. Ross would disagree. Now, This does not yet tell us how we gain knowledge of what we ought to do in particular cases, because every single case is different. When prima facie duties conflict, and this is a claim that the author makes of Ross's critics, Ross's theory gives us no mechanical way of deciding which one takes precedence. Now, here's my rejoinder. This is perhaps because moral reasoning is not so simple and mechanical in nature anyway, just as situations are often very complex. Now, why do you think it is that some people demand something like a mechanical decision procedure? This is something that almost all of us likely would like to err on the side of. Yeah, it would be really nice if you had a mechanical process where you could just shove all of your information into it, like a meat grinder. Sorry, vegetarians. Like a meat grinder, and at the end of the day, or at the end of the process, the moral point of view would spit out. That would be very, very nice. Well, in Ross's defense, I would say that's not how the real world situations tend to work. Situations are typically, I won't say typically, are often endlessly complex. So it would be difficult to say ahead of time what an individual ought to do in a given situation, unless you have all of the details. And by the way, there's a good chance that even if several different people had all the details, they might disagree. Why? Because we might make different value judgments about which of the prima facie duties ought to override in certain situations. And that's probably true. However, in most situations that are not overly complex, Ross would contend that most reasonably prudent people would tend to agree about the moral point of view more than they would likely disagree. I'll go with that easy situation I gave a few minutes ago. I make a promise to my wife, but a case of serious injury occurs and I have an opportunity to help out. In that case, my fidelity duty would be overridden by a duty to be benevolent in this particular situation. And most reasonably prudent people would likely agree with that. Oh, and by the way, I hope that you know that breaking a promise is never okay just because you want to get your butt out of the suit. In other words, behaving purely self-interestedly is already ruled out by prima facie duties. This isn't to say that you shouldn't sometimes consider yourself. Because as a matter of fact, take a guess what we also have duties to. And most pluralistic ethics will admit this. We do have duties to ourselves. We have duties to ourselves. The duty to self-improvement is in part a duty to oneself. It's also in part a duty to other people. Because when I improve myself, I do good for me, which is good for me, but I also am better enabled to serve other people, those people who I also owe duties to. Now, exactly what self-improvement entails, and this is kind of why I brought this up, I would say it's a fairly difficult thing to precisely define. And if I decide arbitrarily to self-improve myself in particular ways and neglect others of my duties, I would hope that you would say that I had failed. Suppose I monomaniacally get obsessed with my health, and I'm constantly trying to train to run marathons and so forth, and I end up neglecting my family in the process. I could hear someone saying, but he's worked really hard at self-improvement. Well, It's kind of self-improvement, but if I'm spending all my time doing that, I would wonder if it should really count as actual self-improvement. Because if I'm monomaniacally pursuing something, I'm probably neglecting relationships that matter too, and I might be neglecting other elements of my self-improvement. I'm just throwing these examples out there to sort of show you how some of this can apply in particular situations, and also partly to make a point that Ross would make. Even though even though you need to look at situations in their particularity when you're analyzing what you ought to do, it is not merely a matter of what? Please do not think that his position is a relativist position. He would deny that vehemently. It is not really up to the individual. Please don't make that mistake. As a matter of fact, it is up to you to rationally consider your duties against a set of particulars and come to the conclusion that is most coherent with what rationality would tell you to do, how to apply the principles to that situation. In other words, he is trying to make a case that applying these duties, while not mechanical and not easy, is still quasi-objective. Am I clear there? In other words, you should still be trying as best you can to be unbiased and look at things objectively in order to find out what the moral point of view is. Now, by the way, his critics would think that it was too subjective, because as long as you start to talk about particulars rather than in abstract generalities, the critics start to think it looks too relativistic. And they hate relativistic, because once you start to add things like that in, they believe it's a slippery slope to whatever floats your boat, or whatever you happen to think it is. Now, the author of the text finally talks about one more, what he calls radical position. An even more radical position than Ross. And I don't think Ross's position is radical at all. And that's why I was explaining that he sees his account as quasi-objective. An even more radical approach is known as ethical particularism. It rejects both absolutism and the notion that there are any prima facie duties. Now remember, Ross rejected absolutism, but he contended that there are prima facie duties, even though they're not actual duties because they're not absolute. There are things that we should consider when we are doing moral reasoning, moral decision making. Particularism rejects both of these. Now, according to particularism, whether a feature of a situation is morally relevant or not depends entirely on the context. The primary challenge for particularism is that some things such as justice do seem to have at least some moral importance in all situations. In other words, we should try to do what's fair, to put it in a more Kantian way. Now, critics of particularism will suggest that as long as you're not talking about any, overriding principles, it seems very relativistic. It seems very relativistic. So if you're afraid of that, the danger of that, whatever floats your boat, relativism, ethical particularism isn't something that you should really want to consider. However, Ross's account doesn't have that problem because there are duties. Now, a couple things to think about. I'll just read these for us. You might want to consider what you think is the biggest attraction of Ross's view. Some of my take on that is, if you think that utilitarianism doesn't fully cover things, but the claims of utilitarians matter, well, understandably, you would like that. If you think that the principles of Kant, his values matter too. Ross's attempts to be more inclusive of more values and duties than these monistic theories do. Now, you might want to be able to explain the attractions of this theory and discuss whether or not these are sufficient reasons for accepting his view or not. Now, we just talked about this. How does he claim that we have come to have what he calls moral knowledge? Well, we understand what our prima facie duties are, and we attempt to analyze situations in terms of those duties. And admittedly, in some situations, some of those duties might not even apply to that particular situation. So you can quickly kind of say, well, these seem to be the two duties right here. Now, you might find it unsatisfying because some critics want that mechanical decision procedure. Now, you'll notice if you thought that Kant's system or utilitarianism had a mechanical decision procedure, guess again. Even though theirs are much more simple because their theories were monistic, didn't mean it necessarily made things any easier, or maybe it did. Because for those of you who are talking about things like trolley car problems, for utilitarianism, the trolley car problem solution is a no-brainer, as they say. So maybe they are quasi-mechanical in some situations. But simply because they're quasi-mechanical and simple doesn't mean that we didn't have objections to them. Because what about the dignity of the individual? That kind of thing. Ross's pluralism tries to account for all of these duties that he thinks that most of us self-evidently think matter. Cheers.